To understand the essence of modern surveillance, we need to look back at an 18th century concept, Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. Bentham, a British philosopher and social reformer, envisioned the Panopticon as an architectural structure designed to be a new mode of obtaining power over the mind. This structure was circular, with cells lining the outer walls and a central watchtower allowing a single guard to observe all prisoners. Crucially, while the prisoners couldn't see the guard, they were always aware of the possibility of being watched, which led them to self-regulate. Bentham believed the Panopticon would revolutionize prisons, schools, and other institutions, creating an automatic function of power, a system where individuals self-police because they assume they're being observed. In Bentham's words, the more constantly they imagine themselves to be observed, the more effectually they are kept under. This constant awareness of possible surveillance induces self-discipline without the need for physical punishment or direct oversight. The Panopticon, in other words, turns surveillance into a form of psychological control. As Bentham said, the object of the Panopticon is not to imprison, but to monitor, not to punish, but to shape behavior, creating individuals who discipline themselves through the mere possibility of observation. While Bentham's Panopticon was never fully realized as a building, it became something far more powerful, a metaphor for control through surveillance, a model for how observation could shape behavior at every level of society. Over a century later, French philosopher Michel Foucault expanded Bentham's idea in his book Discipline and Punish. Foucault argued that the Panopticon wasn't just a prison design, it was a model of power. To Foucault, the Panopticon illustrated how modern societies exercise control, not by direct force, but by making people internalize the rules of those in power. This form of control became the foundation for his theory of disciplinary power. According to Foucault, disciplinary power operates through systems that monitor and regulate individuals at all levels. It's the power that trains soldiers, educates students, and normalizes citizens, subtly shaping their behavior to fit societal expectations. And it does this by creating environments where people believe they're being watched. This doesn't require constant oversight. Just the potential of observation is enough. The result is self-policing. Individuals who discipline themselves because they're conditioned to do so. As Foucault said, visibility is a trap. The Panopticon functions as a laboratory of power, where individuals are caught up in a power situation, of which they are themselves the bearers. But Foucault took Bentham's Panopticon even further, by applying it to modern governance. He introduced the concept of biopower, a way of managing populations not through direct force, but by overseeing, categorizing, and conditioning people's lives. Surveillance in the digital age, as Panopticon of Fear argues, is a direct extension of this concept. Modern biopower operates through invisible mechanisms embedded in everyday life, from facial recognition cameras to online tracking. Today's surveillance is embedded in our homes, workplaces, and devices. And while it may appear to be protective, it's also deeply intrusive. The individual becomes a self-regulating subject, constantly modifying their behavior to fit the expectations of a system that they may never fully see. And unlike Bentham's Panopticon, today's observers are not just a few guards, but complex networks of cameras, algorithms, and state systems that operate globally. Modern biopower relies on making surveillance invisible, blurring the lines between public and private life. Today's Panopticon is everywhere and nowhere at once, creating self-regulating individuals who are complicit in their own surveillance. The Panopticon, as designed by Jeremy Bentham, was never just about watching. It was about creating an environment where the watched internalized control, policing themselves to avoid punishment. This architecture of control now finds its reflection in today's digital surveillance state. When the US passed the Patriot Act in 2001, the foundation was laid for a vast, unseen watchtower in the form of mass data collection, monitoring, and preemptive profiling. Section 215, known as the Business Records Provision, allows the government to collect any tangible thing relevant to national security investigations. This includes phone records, internet history, and financial transactions. Similarly, Section 702, an amendment to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, authorizes the mass collection of communication data, including the emails and phone calls of both foreign and domestic individuals. These provisions create a system where, much like the Panopticon, the public is aware of the possibility of being watched, but not necessarily the extent to which they are observed. Just as Bentham's Panopticon was designed to create self-disciplining prisoners, the Patriot Act creates self-policing citizens who internalize the fear of surveillance, curbing their own behaviors to avoid drawing attention. Modern-day surveillance under the Patriot Act reflects the Panopticon's oppressive structure. Citizens know they could be monitored, yet they are uncertain when, how, or by whom. This ambiguity breeds self-censorship, a condition where people regulate their behaviors and even thoughts, creating a society that aligns with state-prescribed norms without direct coercion. In Bentham's Panopticon, prisoners disciplined themselves because they knew they could be watched at any moment. In the age of the Patriot Act, we see a similar dynamic. The Patriot Act's surveillance provisions are not just about collecting data. They're about instilling a chilling effect that encourages individuals to self-censor, knowing that the government can access private data. This causes individuals to modify their behavior, avoid sensitive topics online, and even change how they interact with others. Following 9/11, Muslim communities in the US were placed under extensive surveillance. Individuals began to avoid mosque gatherings, refrain from speaking about political issues, and withdraw from community activities to avoid suspicion. Political activists, too, found themselves under scrutiny, with their emails and messages intercepted, their social networks mapped, and their private lives open to government eyes. Fear-based governance doesn't merely observe. It creates fearful citizens who self-censor to avoid becoming targets of suspicion. The Patriot Act is a modern panopticon, inducing compliance not through direct enforcement, but through the very awareness of being potentially watched. The fear of surveillance impacts all citizens, even if they aren't directly targeted. Studies show that individuals reduce political engagement, avoid sensitive topics online, and alter their searches when they know their activities are being monitored. The Panopticon is no longer a physical building, it's a psychological state that discourages dissent, activism, and free expression. The Patriot Act didn't just transform American surveillance, it became a model for global monitoring. By normalizing mass surveillance, the US paved the way for other countries to adopt similar practices, creating what Panopticon of Fear calls a transnational panopticon. This global spread of surveillance reflects the panopticon's oppressive structure, as countries increasingly rely on data monitoring to control and categorize their populations. In China, the social credit system uses data gathered from everyday transactions to score citizens on their behavior, impacting their access to services, loans, and even travel. India's Aadhaar program, while aimed at streamlining access to essential services, has raised concerns due to its extensive collection of biometric data, which could be used to monitor and control citizens. Surveillance has become a global phenomenon, replicating the panopticon across borders. The US set a precedent with the Patriot Act, and now countries worldwide have embraced similar measures, creating a transnational web of control. The Patriot Act may have been justified as a counterterrorism measure, but it has since become a blueprint for a world where government prioritizes control over privacy. This model imposes the Panopticon's logic globally, where citizens everywhere learn to comply, self-censor, and ultimately accept surveillance as an unavoidable reality. One of the most troubling aspects of the Patriot Act is the paradox of security it embodies. Despite the vast amounts of data collected on citizens, surveillance often fails to prevent real threats. Instead, it creates an illusion of safety while contributing to a culture of fear and compliance. Data overload, created by indiscriminate data collection under the Patriot Act, has ironically hindered the ability to detect actual threats. This mass surveillance creates a bureaucratic machine more focused on sustaining itself than on effectively protecting citizens. The paradox is clear. More surveillance does not equal more security, but it does create a more compliant populace. Fear-based governance promises safety but delivers fear and anxiety, producing a society that self-censors while remaining vulnerable to real threats. Ultimately, the Patriot Act represents a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more fear it creates, the more surveillance it demands. But as Panopticon of Fear argues, this approach undermines the very security it aims to protect, eroding civil liberties, increasing distrust, and ultimately destabilizing society.